Breaking tonight, Donald Trump sends a letter to Mark Carney threatening a 35% tariff on Canada.
That Trump has signed that executive order increasing tariff on Canada from 25% to 35%, with higher tariffs set to go into effect as of August 1st. That's midnight tonight. So that's the breaking news.
Pressing the Prime Minister directly, Trump says that number could go up if Canada retaliates. We have the latest from Washington and analysis from Ottawa.
Trump thought he could squeeze Canada into submission. On August 1st, 2025, he pulled the trigger, raising tariffs from 25% to 35% on Canadian goods.
We like Canada. I love Canada. I have so many friends in Canada. But they've been very poorly led. They've been very, very poorly led. And
a move designed to humble Ottawa. Instead, it backfired in spectacular fashion. Within 72 hours, Canada declared something unthinkable, a trade blackout on America.
One of the reasons why we have retaliatory tariffs on over $90 billion worth of U.S. goods. We are in intensive negotiations with the Americans and in parallel preparing reprisals if those negotiations do not succeed.
Not a minor retaliation, not symbolic. A calculated counterstrike that exposed just how fragile Washington's economic armor really is. The world watched as Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled what insiders called the nuclear option. Canada slashed its dependence on U.S. exports, diverted gold shipments to the UK, and began weaponizing its critical resources, lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths, that the Pentagon can't live without. The result? America's consumers bled, industries panicked, and allies took notice. And this was just the beginning. Stay with me, hit like and subscribe, because what comes next will shock you. Trump's tariff war didn't begin with a whisper. It detonated like a bomb. At exactly 12:01 a.m. on August 1st, 2025, the White House announced that tariffs on Canadian imports would rise from 25% to a brutal 35%. This wasn't a quiet maneuver. It was a political firework designed for the cameras, sold to the American public as a bold act of economic liberation. But liberation for whom? The fallout was immediate and vicious. American retailers had warned for months that even a slight increase would squeeze margins. And now, within hours, the prices of ordinary goods spiked. A simple hoodie at Walmart, once $6.98, was suddenly tagged at nearly $10.98. Coffee, an American morning staple, jumped 40% overnight. Cars, already battered by inflation, rose between 4% and 8%, leaving families stunned at dealership lots. For the political showman in Washington, it was a headline victory. For the millions living paycheck to paycheck, it was a knife to the throat. But here's the twist: Canada didn't blink. Most nations, when cornered by America, flinch. They negotiate. They stall. They cave. But Prime Minister Mark Carney had a different playbook. Within 72 hours, Ottawa responded with what analysts are calling a trade blackout. What does that mean? It means Canada stopped playing by Washington's rules. For decades, America had been Canada's economic lifeline. 78% of Canadian exports flowed south across the border. Carney's move slashed that reliance to 68% in a single year, an almost surgical decoupling of the world's largest trading relationship. That 10-point drop wasn't symbolic. It was catastrophic for U.S. industries. And the numbers are staggering. Gold exports to the United Kingdom didn't just increase. They exploded by 473%. Shipments of grain and lumber found new homes in Europe, Mexico, and Japan. Even Australia, once a secondary partner, emerged as a top buyer of Canadian resources. The message was unmistakable. Canada could survive without America. But America could not survive without Canada. Washington laughed at first, dismissed it as posturing. But beneath the bravado, panic set in. Because Canada wasn't just moving goods. It was moving power. Carney knew that Canada's greatest weapon wasn't maple syrup, lumber, or even oil. It was the treasure buried beneath its soil: lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth minerals. In an age when every fighter jet, every smartphone, every electric car depends on these materials, Canada holds the keys to the future. And here's the dagger twist. Canada is one of the few nations outside of China with large, untapped reserves of these critical minerals. By cutting back U.S. supply and redirecting contracts to allies in Europe and Asia, Canada began carving out a new role, the alternative to Chinese dominance. Think about what that means. For the Pentagon, already stretched thin by global commitments, this wasn't just economics. It was national security. The chips in missiles, the batteries in military drones, the sensors in submarines. Without Canadian minerals, the supply chain began to buckle. Defense analysts in Washington called it a nightmare scenario. Meanwhile, the pain trickled down to ordinary Americans. Families in Ohio and Michigan, already battered by inflation, suddenly saw the price of imported cars skyrocket. Farmers, once dependent on exporting dairy and beef to Canada, watched contracts vanish. Florida, a state that relies on Canadian tourism like lungs rely on oxygen, faced an unprecedented collapse. Over 3.4 million Canadians, worth $6 billion annually to Florida's economy, stopped crossing the border. Beaches were empty. Hotels/staff. Restaurant owners begged for relief. And the corporate giants weren't spared either. Ford Motor Company alone projected over $1 billion in extra costs from the tariff war. Walmart and Costco, symbols of affordable living, were forced to raise prices on essentials, sparking outrage from the very voters Trump had promised to protect. This wasn't the script Washington expected. Trump's gamble was simple: pressure Canada until it broke. But instead, it was the U.S. economy that fractured first. Canadian retaliation wasn't loud or chaotic. It was cold, calculated, and devastating. And what stunned observers most wasn't just the numbers, it was the strategy. Carney unveiled a trade pivot that analysts now call the nuclear option, not because it destroyed America overnight, but because it shifted the balance of global power in slow motion. By diversifying into Europe, Asia, and Latin America, Canada reduced its vulnerability to U.S. pressure. Every deal signed with Japan or the EU wasn't just about money. It was about creating a shield against American dominance. At the same time, Canada launched what many are calling a politeness offensive. Instead of framing its blackout as war, it wrapped retaliation in the language of cooperation and partnership. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford spearheaded domestic campaigns, encouraging Canadians to buy Canadian, be Canadian. Patriotic branding hit grocery stores, clothing racks, and auto dealerships. Families began choosing homegrown goods not out of sacrifice, but pride. That unity made retaliation sustainable. While Washington fought to contain consumer outrage, Canadians rallied behind their government. The contrast could not have been sharper. And here's the bigger picture. America's tariff barrage on August 1st wasn't just an attack on Canada. It was an attack on the very foundation of the U.S. Canada-Mexico Agreement, USMCA. By pushing Ottawa into survival mode, Trump risked unraveling North America's most important trade pact. Already, whispers in Mexico City hinted at re-evaluating its own alignment. Washington's gamble threatened not just one relationship, but the entire regional framework. But that wasn't the whole story. Because while Canada was carving out new alliances, another player was quietly cashing in on America's chaos. And what happened next would shock everyone. While Washington scrambled to contain the fallout, another superpower was smiling. Because in Trump's rush to punish Canada, he had quietly given China exactly what it wanted. On the very same day that tariffs on Canada jumped to 35%, the White House announced a 90-day tariff truce with Beijing. The logic was political. Trump wanted to cool tensions with China to stabilize Wall Street ahead of the election cycle. But geopolitics doesn't wait for politics. In reality, that truce became a gift-wrapped opportunity for Beijing to expand its global grip. Here's how. While America was busy bleeding from its northern border, China moved aggressively into Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. New infrastructure deals, mining contracts, and energy corridors were signed at lightning speed. The Belt and Road Initiative, already the largest infrastructure project in human history, suddenly accelerated. And the biggest loser in that expansion wasn't Canada. It was the United States. Because while Washington was obsessed with humiliating Ottawa, Beijing was building the very supply chains America would soon depend on. Now picture this. The Pentagon, already warning Congress about shortages of rare earths, suddenly found itself staring at two closed doors. On one side, China, the global giant of critical minerals. On the other, Canada, the the Democratic alternative that had just declared a trade blackout. The U.S. military, caught between adversary and ally, realized it was running out of options. And here's the brutal irony. Trump's tariff war, designed to showcase American strength, had revealed American weakness. But the pain wasn't just geopolitical. It was painfully personal. On Main Street, ordinary Americans were being crushed. Coffee, a simple daily ritual, was up 40%. Athletic shoes from Canadian suppliers? Up nearly 30%. Cars manufactured with Canadian steel? Up as much as 8%. Every shopping trip became a reminder that the trade war wasn't a distant political game. It was dinner tables, closets, and commutes. The backlash grew fast. In Michigan, auto workers staged protests after Ford announced looming job cuts linked to the extra $1 billion in costs. In Ohio, farmers marched on state capitals demanding relief as Canadian contracts vanished. In Florida, hotel owners lobbied Congress after losing their most reliable tourists. 3.4 million Canadians who once filled beaches and restaurants, now gone. And yet, in Canada, the story looked entirely different. Instead of chaos, there was cohesion. Instead of outrage, there was resolve. Ottawa launched a carefully orchestrated domestic unity campaign. Grocery stores rolled out Canadian-grown labels. Auto dealerships ran ads framing Canadian cars as a patriotic choice. Social media campaigns flooded feeds with slogans like "Built by Canadians, for Canadians." Ontario's Doug Ford became the unlikely face of the movement, crisscrossing the province to promote homegrown industries. Critics mocked it as corny nationalism, but it worked. For the first time in decades, Canadians saw self-reliance as strength. What began as a response to Trump's tariffs turned into a cultural shift, a new economic nationalism rooted in quiet defiance. And it was contagious. Mexico, watching the trade war unfold, began exploring deeper partnerships with Canada and Europe. Japan and Australia, two Pacific powers wary of China, rushed to sign contracts with Canadian miners. The European Union, desperate to cut dependence on Russian energy and Chinese minerals, found in Canada a stable and resource-rich partner. In less than a year, Canada transformed from a junior partner clinging to America into a global supplier courted by the world's largest economies. Meanwhile, the United States found itself isolated. And this raised an even more dangerous question. What about the USMCA? The U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement was supposed to be the backbone of North American trade, ensuring stability and integration. But Trump's unilateral tariffs shattered its credibility. Canadian officials began openly questioning the pact's future. Mexican officials hinted at re-evaluating their commitments. For states like Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois, this wasn't just bad news, it was catastrophic. Factories dependent on cross-border supply chains faced the unthinkable shutdowns. And then came the warning shot. Leaked reports from Ottawa suggested that if Washington continued its tariff assault, Canada would formally suspend parts of the USMCA. Analysts called it economic war. For many Americans, it already felt like one. But even beyond trade, something deeper was happening. America's global image, the image of reliability, dominance, and inevitability, was eroding. Allies in Europe and Asia watched Trump attack his closest neighbor and wondered, if this is how Washington treats friends, what does that mean for us? And here lies the core of the crisis. Trump's tariff escalation wasn't just about economics. It was about trust. The United States had always leaned on Canada as its most dependable ally, a partner in wars, a partner in intelligence, a partner in trade. By weaponizing tariffs against Ottawa, Washington broke a bond that had held firm through world wars, depressions, and Cold Wars. Now, that bond is fractured. Canada had shown it could survive without the U.S. by pivoting to Europe, Asia, and Latin America. America, on the other hand, had shown just how dependent it remained on Canadian goods, Canadian resources, and Canadian consumers. The illusion of dominance had been shattered. And here's the most chilling part. The trade blackout wasn't temporary. It wasn't symbolic. It was structural. The new trade routes Canada forged, with the UK, Japan, Australia, Mexico, and the EU, aren't short-term bandages. They're long-term lifelines. Even if Trump were to roll back tariffs tomorrow, Canada wouldn't come crawling back. It wouldn't need to. The damage was already permanent. Which leaves us with a haunting question. What happens when America loses not just one trade partner, but the credibility of being the world's economic anchor? Because make no mistake, this wasn't just about Ottawa and Washington. This was about a world shifting toward multipolarity, where U.S. leverage is no longer absolute, and where Canada, of all nations, just proved it. But the story doesn't end here, because the next phase of this economic war may be even darker than the first. So here we are. A tariff war that was supposed to humble Canada has instead humbled America. Prices are rising, factories are hurting, and the trust between two of the closest allies on Earth is shattered. Canada isn't crawling back, it's carving a new place in the world. And for Washington, that reality is terrifying, because this isn't just about trade. It's about the collapse of U.S. leverage. It's about allies questioning America's reliability. It's about the rise of a multipolar world where the U.S. no longer calls all the shots. The question is simple. Will Trump double down and escalate? Or will he retreat and try to repair the damage? And even if he does, is it already too late? If you found this breakdown eye-opening, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss what's coming next.